is Eric Michael Loyd, master student in clinical psychology. I want to read a book that many of these reads are first read for me. I'd like to read out loud and for others as well. On this one, Bill Gates, The Life, Lessons and Rules for Success. From Influential Individuals, 50 Most Memorable Quotes and 15 Success Principles to Live by, cultivated from the wisdom of Bill Gates. I'm going to go ahead and read several of these pages here. Probably about 30 pages. Bill Gates is the most influential and recognizable name in technology industry to date. A business magnate, avid investor, heavy philanthropist, and author of multiple books, Gates and his partner Paul Allen together co-founded the technology mogul Microsoft, which quickly grew into the globe's largest PC software company. Gates held different positions at Microsoft over the years, from chief software architect to chairperson and CEO. Up until May 2014, he was also the largest shareholder of the company. If that is not impressive enough, Gates is currently the richest person in the world with a net worth of over $87 billion. One of his most notable ventures in the latter years of his business ventures has been the partnership he took on with Warren Buffett when they founded the Giving Pledge. This was a cause that encouraged billionaires around the globe to make a pledge promising they would eventually give at least half their entire wealth to philanthropy. Born in Seattle, Washington, to a father who was a very prominent lawyer in the community and a mother who regularly served on the board of directors for the United Way and First Interstate Bank System, growing up, his parents' dream for him was to practice law like his father. Many people who knew the Gates family a similar view. Many people who knew the Gates family had a similar view. They were incredibly competitive. Those who grew up and lived alongside the family have always said, no matter what, there was a reward for winning a penalty and a penalty for losing. It did not matter if the kids were playing pinball or competing in sports. The only thing that mattered was for every win, there was a reward, and for every loss, a consequence. This explains a lot behind Gates' eventual wealth and success. He was raised in an environment that outwardly rewarded or penalized every action he made. This makes a child very aware of his decisions they are making and prompts them to learn how to reason and project possible futures based on scenarios as well as actions taken. This is a skill that he would hone and develop as he grew older, and is argued to be the greatest driving force behind his current success as an adult. When he was 13, he officially enrolled into his first private prep school. He would end up exploring his first piece of technology that was paid for by the proceeds from a rummage sale the Mothers Club was throwing. They ended up utilizing the profits to purchase a teletype model 33 ASR terminal, as well as a block of computer time on a General Electric computer. This was to benefit the entire student body as a whole, but obviously certain students took more of an interest than others. Gates was hooked and invested in learning how to program the system. His thirst for knowledge was so great that his math teachers would excuse him from class simply to allow him to go and learn the system. This would be the machine he would write his first piece of code on. The code was an electronic implementation of the traditional tic-tac-toe game that could enable people who used the computer to play against it. Gates would play at every opportunity he got. His school friends soon became entranced with the game. as he watched his fellow student reap the joy from the game he had programmed and loaded onto the computer, he became more and more fascinated with this piece of technology, what this piece of technology was capable of doing. He loved how it could always execute the software he programmed perfectly, and he reflects upon this learning experience with only 4 words. This machine was neat. This love of technology would soon lead into his first ever reprimand on a piece of technology after the Mothers Club donations had been financially exhausted. Gates and some other student who had struck up similar interests with the piece of technology went to go find alternative time solutions on various systems and mini computers. Gates and 4 friends would eventually be banned for an entire summer from the Computer Center Corporation because they were caught finding and exploiting bugs within the main operating systems in order to garner themselves more free computer time. Eventually, CCC finally smartened up and offered the kids an offer they couldn't refuse. They told the children they could have more computer time in exchange for finding bugs within the operating systems and software that CCC's computers were utilizing. Jumping at the opportunity, Gates found himself going to the CCC's office and studying their base source codes in order to familiarize himself with back-end knowledge as to how all of their systems worked. The boys would continue to be under this agreement until 1970, when the computing company went under. They would not be out of work for long. Information Scientists, Inc. would end up hiring these same 4 students after hearing of their previous arrangement and technology prowess. Their task? To write a payroll program in a specific coding language. The compensation was not just computer time, however. This time they were offered royalties, and this would be the first time that Gates would find monetary compensation for his newfound passion. Pretty soon, the administrators above Gates all became aware of his programming capabilities. They would get him to program his own school's electronic classroom assignment software, whereby students could be electronically scheduled for classes they signed up for. Being the young man he was, he ended up utilizing this to his advantage by placing himself in classes that had a vastly large number of interesting girls within them. Gates ended up graduating from his Lakeside Preparatory School in 1973 as a National Merit Scholar, and he ended up only being 10 points underneath a perfect 1600 score when he took the SAT Scholastic Aptitude Test required for enrolling in college. In the fall of that graduating year, Gates would enroll into Harvard College and choose pre-law as his major, much to the delight of his parents. He would also end up overloading his schedule to take challenging and time-consuming mathematical classes as well as graduate-level computer science courses, much to the shock of his professors. During his college years at Harvard, Gates took on a series of unsolved problems given to his class taught by Harry Lewis. It was a combinatorics class, and the algorithm that Gates devised for pancake sorting was not only correct, but it provided the fastest sorting solution to the problem for over 3 decades. It was so fast, in fact, that when the successor of the challenge beat Gates' sorting speed solution, it was faster by a mere 1%. Even though his major was pre-law, Gates really did not know what he wanted to do with his study plan at Harvard. He spent a great deal of time with the school's computers, and it was during these pre-law college years that him and Paul Allen would begin their own infamous software company. Much to the initial dismay of his parents, when the software company launched, Gates dropped out of Harvard in order to pursue his passions. But while his parents were disappointed in his dropping out, they finally supported him in his technological ventures despite the dreams they might have had for him. Gates did end up giving his parents peace of mind, though, striking a deal with Harvard that if this budding technological company did not work, he would be free to come back and resume his studies without having to officially enroll again. I guess you could say this budding technological company worked out. Lessons learned. Bill Gates' parents wanted him to be a lawyer, but from a young age, he showed incredible programming and technological skills. He would eventually drop out of Harvard and take an official leave of absence in order to pursue Microsoft. A competitive family home seems to have aided in his eventual success. Here's another great example of the old adage, follow your passions. Beginnings in business. In the beginning, both Gates and Allen were incredibly adventurous with their personal endeavors towards technology. After they read an issue of Popular Electronics at the beginning of 1975, is over 100 years old, it prompted them to contact micro instrumentation and telemetry systems, feeding them a lie to gouge potential interests in their skills. The lie? They told MITS, M-I-T-S, that they were developing a basic interpreter for the platform that was being utilized on the Altair 8800. The reality of the situation was that they were not, nor had they written any code for it. The actual aim was to gauge their reaction and to weigh the pros and cons of taking on something of that magnitude. In short, they wanted to know if there was a market. The response was so positive that the MITS president, Ed Roberts, actually agreed to meet the duo to see a demo of the program they had not yet created. Over the course of a few weeks, they ended up developing an emulator for the Altair that ran on a simple microcomputer. They then utilized the foundation to create the basic interpreter for the system. The demonstration was a success, and this resulted in a massive deal between the company and the duo in order to distribute the interpreter as Altair Basic. From this, Paul Allen was hired to MITS, and Gates was made his leave of absence from Harvard permanent in order to work alongside Allen at MITS in Albuquerque. Many of you might know this story already. It's a great story. This is actually where the term Microsoft developed. When they scored their first big partnership with a company, they decided they needed a name for their own partnership. So they named their partnership Micro-Soft. And their first office was located in Albuquerque, near where they were working for MITS, M-I-T-S. A year after striking up that partnership and officially naming it, they dropped the hyphen and created the trade name Microsoft. And officially, it had registered in the state of New Mexico. At this point, it became very clear to both Gates and his parents that he was not returning to his studies. Every rising success story always has its first pitfall. The first technological scandal Gates ever ran into was when he discovered that a copy of Altair Basic had leaked into the community before it was released officially. It was being copied and widely distributed. At the beginning of 1976, Gates wrote a very open letter to computer hobbyists in the MITS newsletter and stated, among other things, that more than 90% of the users that were currently utilizing Microsoft Altair Basic had not actually paid for the product. And by not paying for the product, Gates outlined exactly why it was now in danger of eliminating the very incentive that any professional developer had to create, distribute, and help maintain high-quality software. He stressed that software developers had just as much of a right to demand pay for their work as anyone else in the technological industry. Out of this scandal, Microsoft ended up becoming independent of MITS later that year, continuing its development in programming language software for multiple different systems. At the beginning of 1979, they moved operations from Albuquerque, New Mexico to Bellevue, Washington, and never looked back. During Microsoft's early years, Gates saw his responsibility for the budding company flourish. Paul Allen would find his place in the chaos, and the first employees would end up having a very broad responsibility for the company's overall business dealings. Gates not only oversaw the business details, but also continued to do what he loved most, write code. Incredibly, Gates personally oversaw and received every single line of code that the company ever shipped in the first 5 years. often rewriting parts as he saw fit before distributing it to customers. In July 1980, IBM approached Microsoft in regards to a personal computer. The IBM PC that it was about to release to the public. The computer company wanted to sit down and talk with Microsoft about writing an IBM basic interpreter that would be unique to their own systems. Not only that, but IBM also expressed interest in developing an operating system alongside Microsoft. The discussions ended up going poorly, and they could not reach a unanimous licensing agreement. However, when IBM representative Jack Sam and Bill Gates sat down together to work things out, they would end up coming to an agreement through Gates proposing the 86-DOS operating system. The only issue being that the operating system was very similar to PC/M, the operating system that Seattle Computer Products was already utilizing. Microsoft then had to end up cutting a deal with SCP in order to become the exclusive licensing agent and full owner of 86-DOS. After becoming the full legal owner of that operating system, they were able to adapt it to IBM's personal computer, and Microsoft ended up delivering this operating system to the technological company as PC-DOS. The price? A one-time fee of $50,000. Similarly, Gates ended up not transferring the copyright onto the operating system. He believed other hardware vendors would try to clone the IBM system, and then they would be out of leverage with their own technological market. Because of this, MS-DOS made Microsoft a massive player within their industry. And even though IBM's name was on the operating system, the media quickly pinpointed and identified Microsoft as being very influential on this new computer that was taking over the market. The press was so great and the exposure so loud that their stock rose and demand was huge. This singular event had helped them spiral into a restructuring phase that took place in 1981. Gates was not only made president of the company, but also its board chairman. However, the Microsoft and IBM partnership was not always meant to be. Microsoft ended up launching its first retail version of Microsoft Windows in 1985, striking a deal with IBM in order to develop a separate operating system for their IBM computers. Creative differences at every corner would end up causing great tension between the two companies, with their partnership deteriorating, and eventually it dissolved beyond repair. What sets Gates apart from many is that he established his management style very young in Microsoft years. He was able to bring a massive technological company to fruition whilst being considered distant from others. Many people actually complained that he was never reachable by his phone and rarely returned phone calls. However, that did not mean that he was not hands-on. Gates would meet regularly with the senior and program managers of Microsoft in order to listen to new, fresh ideas and proposals. There were many first-hand accounts of these meetings that are drawn on when talking about Gates' management style, with him often being described as verbally combative and constantly berating, At this point, he was even considered a risk to the long-term interests of the company. It turns out this style was for good measure. The whole reasoning behind these outbursts was to get people to defend their proposals in great and utter detail, with such conviction that Gates would be fully convinced that he could not only implement the proposal, but hire the creator of the proposal to oversee its implementation. This seemingly verbal abuse in meetings was really Gates vetting whom he was going to hire for specific proposals he decided to take on. If the person could not defend the proposal adequately, then he would not only disregard hiring the person, but also disregard the proposal as well. Gates understood what he wanted to do and where his place was from an incredibly young age. The inventions he took on at the things he did in high school and post-Harvard solidified his place in the technological industry. The young mogul was not simply a developer of electronics, he was a creator of an entirely new platform that had not yet emerged onto the market. Gates was a young inventor who was grooming himself to become a lifelong influencer. Lessons learned. Bill Gates and Paul Allen's first big break was based on a lie. Bluffing can occasionally be beneficial if you have the tools to eventually back it up. Microsoft and IBM established their official partnership. Gates knew he was no longer returning to Harvard. The trademark name Microsoft simply comes from the term that was coined by Gates and Allen when they decided to officially name their partnership. Gates had a unique way of managing, but it always seemed to ensure working the best. Even the best companies in the world face pitfalls and challenges. Next part of the young inventor. A common misconception about Gates is that he is a serial inventor. On the contrary, he found himself to be exceptionally passionate about and skilled at one particular thing. He capitalized on that one particular facet and made his entire fortune based around it. However, he did have one mishap during his young inventor days: trafo data. If you have not heard of trafo data, then you are not alone. It was his first company venture with Paul Allen and was a system that was supposed to read and process traffic tapes. The issue was that they never fully got it to work properly, and Gates was never able to sell it in order to garner the money necessary to make it work better. The attempt with Paul Allen, who would end up being his co-founder for Microsoft, states that even though trafo data was not a success, but it was imperative in preparing both him and Gates to create Microsoft's first ever product that happened a couple of years later. This traffic counter system they attempted to create was supposed to read raw data from counters installed on roadways and generate specific detailed reports for all the traffic engineers in an area. Here's how it was supposed to work. Local and state governments frequently do traffic surveys by putting road tubes across the road that cars will roll over. You've probably seen them around today. This is what establishes the traffic counting system. This black rubber hose that is stretched across the road ends up creating air pulses by the tires that are driven over it, which then activates a roadside counter that records it. This tracks not only the number of vehicles that come through a specific area on a daily basis, but it also tracks the speed at which they're coming, even measuring times where there is the most and least traffic on that specific road. Back during trafo data's time, the time a car approached, as well as the number of axles the car had, was punched in by that rubber hose as a 16-bit pattern into a paper tape. Then, cities would hire private companies to come in and translate the data into reports that traffic engineers needed so they could adjust traffic lights and determine how best to improve roads. If you have ever been traveling down the road and you wonder what this cylindrical black thing is that your tires are about to run over, that is a traffic counter. What Gates and Allen tried to do was to automate the process of extracting this traffic data so it could be cheaper and faster than the local companies being hired privately in order to translate the information. They ended up recruiting their classmates to manually read these hole patterns in the paper tape, and then used these hole patterns to later transcribe the data onto computer cards. Gates would then use a computer to produce traffic flowcharts necessary for traffic engineers. This was how trafo data attempted to get its start. However, despite trafo data's failure, the pair did not give up. Altair Basic, the software company created for MITS, was their next big venture. Altair Basic was so important because the Altair personal computer did not have a screen or keyboard readily installed onto it, and their basic language program made the machine ultimately easier to use. Not only that, but this was the language they utilized to form the foundation of Microsoft programs they developed up until the creation and generation of MS-DOS. Coincidentally enough, the next major invention in Gates' career in MS-DOS Coincidentally enough, the next major invention in Gates' career is MS-DOS. This would be the operating system that would serve as the foundation for Windows OS, which would be the system utilized in Windows 98, 99, ME, 2000, and XP. In order to secure purchase for the DOS operating system, however, they did have to contact the company they had previously done business with in order to secure the licensing rights from them. The negotiations went well, and Microsoft would not only make a ton of money off of the licensing, but they would also make it the standard system for running their specific personal computers. Gates' inventions were then compounded off this system. He would utilize this to develop the entity of Windows, which would become a dominant graphical user interface that would rival their biggest competitor, Apple Macintosh. Gates is not just reputable for his invention skills, he's also lauded for his negotiation skills that converted into incredible business deals. When Gates was talking with IBM about the operating system they had developed, he was coming at it the way he did because he wanted to retain the licensing rights to the foundation that would build MS-DOS. In any other circumstance today, this conversation would more than likely have been shut down very quickly without a second thought between the two parties. However, because Gates' ability to negotiate and swoon, he was able to convince IBM to let him keep the licensing rights to this operating system. And this is what would make Microsoft their fortune. Gates is not simply an incredible inventor, he is also an incredible software programmer and negotiator. While his first company, Trafo Data, did not go as planned, the partnership between him and Allen would bloom into one of the biggest technological companies of all time. It is this company that gave Gates his fortune. Lessons learned. He knew what he was good at from a very young age, and he wanted to pursue all those avenues with his friend Paul Allen. Even the best in the world fail sometimes. The failure of Trafo Data ultimately served to help the duo build their first Microsoft product a couple of years later. It is not merely Gates' ability to invent and program that made him his fortune, but it is also his ability to negotiate. The first company. While Trafo Data was technically Gates' first official venture, it also served as his first failure. Trafo Data was more valuable to him as a learning tool than as a business. So many attribute Gates' incredible success at Microsoft as also being Gates' first company. The Microsoft Corporation is a multinational technology company whose headquarters are located in Redmond, Washington. Microsoft grew to license, develop, create, sell, and support consumer electronics, personal computers, computer software, and all the services that came along with it. To date, the most popular software products are the Microsoft Windows line of operating systems, Internet Explorer, and Microsoft Suite that houses the ever-precious Microsoft Word. However, it also has some hardware products that include the Xbox video game consoles as well as the Microsoft Surface tablet lineup. As if that is not enough, as of 2016, the world's largest software maker by revenue, as well as one of the globe's most valuable companies. It is safe to say that Microsoft has been a massive success for Bill Gates. MS-DOS was created in the mid-1980s, followed quickly by Microsoft Windows. In 1986, Microsoft had their initial public offerings where they saw a subsequent rise in their share prices. This drastic rise in share prices created 3 billionaires and around 12 million millionaires. among the Microsoft employees who were holding shares as business perks for being employed with the company. I think the last time I checked, there was 468 billionaires in the world. I'm not sure what the number is now. Since the 1990s, Microsoft was worked diligently to diversify themselves among the operating system market. And during that pursuit, a number of corporate acquisitions have been made. In 2011, Microsoft ended up acquiring Skype and the technologies that surrounded for $8.5 billion. At the end of 2016, Microsoft added to the portfolio and ended up purchasing LinkedIn for $26 billion. Over the years, Microsoft didn't branch out to create its own line of personal companies and simply stick with engineering and creating the software for these systems. Up until 2012, that is. In 2012, Microsoft officially entered the personal computer production market for the very first time and launched the Microsoft Surface, which was a line of tablet computers. Not too long after, Microsoft acquired smartphone software and introduced themselves into the smartphone hardware market. They acquired Nokia's devices and services and ended up forming Microsoft Mobile as a result, founded in the confidence that the company harnessed from their successful launch of the Surface tablet. With all the success Microsoft has seen, it is no wonder that people are always clamoring to know how it started. Paul Allen and Bill Gates officially established Microsoft on April 4, 1975, during their partnership with MITS. The duo decided to name Gates as the CEO in the beginning, and Paul Allen is the one who attributed to giving it the original name of Microsoft. A couple of years later, they officially declared themselves a company. In August of 1977, the newly budding company formed an agreement with ASCII magazine based out of Japan. This is also because it resulted in the very first international office Microsoft would ever have, entitled ASCII Microsoft, or ASC2 Microsoft, if those are Roman numerals. When the 1980s turned a corner, Microsoft entered the OS business with its own version of Unix. They called it Xenix, and it was popular in its own right. However, MS-DOS was so popular that this was the platform that would solidify the company's dominance in the market in the 1980s. It is this dominance that would set them on the path to harnessing the licensing capabilities for this product. And it is the ability to license the product that would make Microsoft the leading personal computer operating systems vendor. During this time of exploration, Microsoft wanted to attempt expanding into new markets. They released the Microsoft Mouse in 1983 as well as a publishing division entitled Microsoft Press. But during all of these new ventures, Paul Allen would step down from Microsoft after developing Hodgkin's disease, much to Gates' dismay and worry. Microsoft would coast in its revenue acquisitions, allowing their company to ride out these new ventures and see what would come of them until the 1990s. The 1990s would bring a great deal of legal heartache for Gates and Microsoft. Due to the partnership with IBM, the Federal Trade Commission would sink their teeth into Microsoft for possible collusion against IBM. This would mark the beginning of a decade's worth of legal clashes between Microsoft and the U.S. government that would eventually end with all parties wanting the nightmare to end. The case quickly turned into a game of he said, she said, with IBM determined to prove that Microsoft was colluding with competitors in order to bump them out of the game. Microsoft was making the same complaint against IBM. Many different factors went into the investigation the U.S. government conducted into the IBM-Microsoft partnership collusion issue. One of the issues that rose was Microsoft's dominating and almost monopoly market on the operating system software that many personal computers utilized. There were other accusations made, such as the fact that Microsoft integrating Internet Explorer into its software was their version of stealing intellectual property from IBM's attempts to integrate Netscape into its personal computers. In the end, the courts did not seek to break up Microsoft in any fashion. They found them not guilty of any monopoly-like state or collusion, and they merely wanted to find a resolution to the antitrust case as quickly as possible. After this hiccup in Microsoft's history, the company continued to see valuable gains. As the 90s waned on, Microsoft began to redefine its product line once again and expanded its offerings into the computer networking arena as well as the World Wide Web. Due to this expansion, the company released Windows 95. This featured a preemptive multitasking capability, which was a completely new interface that had a novel start button. Not only that, 32-bit capabilities also came bundled with an online service since Microsoft had been found not in violation of any intellectual property rights. For those of you that remember MSN, that was the bundled online service it first offered. Soon after, in 1996, Microsoft would branch itself out again into new territories. Microsoft reached out to NBC Universal to create a 24/7 cable news station entitled MSNBC. If you have ever wondered where the infamous idea for 24/7 cable news stations came from, you can thank Microsoft for it. MSNBC, that's awesome. Rachel Maddow's even awesomer. Microsoft would find itself entrenched once again in legal problems in October 1997, when the U.S. Justice Department filed a motion with many federal district courts. Their motion stated that the company violated an agreement that was signed in 1994 after the previous scandal had been wrapped up, stating that this supposed agreement prohibited the company from bundling any type of internet interface with their Windows products. In the motion, they asked Microsoft to stop bundling Internet Explorer with their Windows products. Bill Gates and the company was no longer a stranger to these types of court cases. With the mounting responsibility of a company such as Microsoft comes the mounting responsibility to defend it when people want to question it. All in all, Microsoft saw large gains, continued accomplishments, and constantly led the frontier in not only the operating systems front, but the media front as well. Various companies banded together and ended up forming the Trusted Computing Platform Alliance in October 1999. This was in order to protect intellectual property and increase intellectual property security by identifying changes in hardware and software on battery just died. Sorry about that. Many of the critics of this alliance, just like critics of Gates later, he wrote to the people of MITS when his software was being illegally distributed, cried out that this was a way to enforce indiscriminate restrictions on how every single customer would utilize their software, would give the alliance potential access to rule how a personal computer behaved. The critics, they saw an example scenario where a computer was not only secured for the owner, but was also secured against the owner. As in, it was their device, but not really their device. On April 3rd, 2000, a judgment would be handed down in the case of United States versus Microsoft, which would end up calling the company an abusive monopoly. Despite the various pitfalls in Microsoft's history, no one can deny that Microsoft was a pioneering frontier leader of technological capabilities. These court cases served as learning tools for Bill Gates. He would find that the company's reputation for quality products that he had worked and striven so hard to build would supersede any ruling these court cases brought down upon the company's head. On January 13, 2000, Bill Gates would hand over his CEO position to Steve Ballmer. his old college friend from his Harvard days, utilizing his newfound time to pursue other philanthropic passions. With Gates's story, there's there's much to be learned through his failures as there are in his successes. Lessons learned. Microsoft had several court cases brought against it for various reasons surrounding becoming a monopoly. To become one of the biggest companies in the world, it is impossible not to step on a few toes in the process. Monopoly or not, Microsoft offered huge value to the market, which will always attract customers. Microsoft continually branched into markets that garnered popularity, but it had not garnered substance. This is why Microsoft excelled greatly in many of the ventures it took on outside the operating systems market. The first of many failures. While Trafo Data might be Gates' most popular failure, it taught both him and Allen, a great deal of lessons in the idea of market research. Time and time again, Paul Allen admits their business plan for the failed traffic information company was flawed, and the fact that they did not bother to do any market research only enhanced their failures. In the few years Trafo Data was up and running, it cost over $3,000 in net profits, forcing the two to shut the doors on their first ever business venture together. But that is not the only failure Bill Gates would encounter during his career. Failure is a key component of success and should be studied due to the lessons it provides. Through learning from failures of others, we can spot common trends and avoid common pitfalls ourselves. It also shows us that even the geniuses of the world will make their errors along the way. A long failure that many business analysts, experts feel Gates made was the fact that he did not engage the government early through the development of a company that would have such an impact on the world. After taking Microsoft from a mere two-man startup all the way to the tech juggernaut it is today, many people believe that Gates did not engage the government nearly enough in the process of Microsoft's rise. When Microsoft's competitors were lobbying the government, Gates' attitude was that the government should just leave them alone. Brad Silverberg, who spent 9 years as Microsoft's senior vice president, has frequently stated he felt this was a massive mistake on Gates' part. Through Gates' eyes, the company was competing fairly, even though it was competing hard. He felt he was creating value for his customers through enhancing their lives, and that should have been enough. Silverberg and many other business analysts attribute the U.S. government's attack on Microsoft that resulted in all those court cases to the fact that Microsoft was not lobbying their points to the government. Microsoft paid a devastating price, both within the media and monetarily. Many people felt it could have been avoided. Gates is notably known for the work he does philanthropically through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. One of the many things they attempted to tackle was working to reduce the size of classrooms in public schools across the nation. However, the foundation also supported Common Core curriculum standards within its attempt at public school reform. This would prove to be a massive downfall for the foundation, and it cost them a great deal of resources and money in the process. Yeah, education is expensive. The foundation greatly underestimated the resources and support that would be required to well-equip educators and implement the standards necessary not only to reduce classroom size, but also to implement this type of curriculum. They missed the opportunity to engage the educators and teachers of this country's children. They also missed an incredible opportunity to immerse the parents and communities in the children's education so that the benefits of this particular standard could have succeeded from the beginning. Whilst CEO of Microsoft, Gates could be accused of lacking in response to the opportunity and threat of the internet. Because Windows in the late 90s was so successful, Gates was focused on protecting Windows and not protecting the company's business and system strategy. And this was what eventually led to Microsoft's position decline from the turn of the millennium. But it seems as if the company is now coming to terms with the new reality stemming from the internet. And it also seems to be making necessary changes that is climbing Microsoft back up the charts. Gates also ignored search engines. In his own words, Google kicked their butts. Larry Page and Sergey Brin launched their little company known as Google in 1998. And around the same time, Gates introduced his own search engine called MSN Search. The little-known Google startup would end up besting the tech giant because Google was not only innovative and fast, it also delivered relevant results. MSN Search had none of the above, and to make matters worse, Microsoft had not even bothered to develop their own algorithm for their own search engine. They simply used search results from an existing search engine called Inktomi. That's Inktomi. The truth of the matter was that search was not a priority for Gates or Microsoft at the time. The company had been focusing solely on the success of Windows, and Google ended up surpassing them by along the way. This would put Microsoft second or even third best to Google ever since. Arguably, the biggest mistake Gates made was funding his competition. As a result of the antitrust suit that Microsoft experienced against IBM, they found themselves at a standstill. Apple agreed to drop their part of the lawsuit in exchange for Microsoft purchasing non-voting shares of stock and supporting Office for the Mac for 5 years. This was a negotiated deal that took place behind closed doors, and it resulted in Gates filtering a lot of money through Apple's doors early on in the company. Well, personally, I'm pretty glad they did make Office for Mac, or otherwise I probably wouldn't be using Office or have to transfer notes in an incompatible and cumbersome process. Apple was also one of the companies that had complained of Microsoft stealing intellectual property from them. The backdoor negotiations went well. Yeah, if you've seen the movie, then you probably know a little bit about that, or several movies on that. Resulting in Apple dropping their portion of the lawsuit. Dropping the lawsuit would then create a cascading effect that would finally bring an end to the antitrust lawsuits. In the end, Microsoft ended up purchasing $150 million in non-voting option stocks, giving Apple the funding needed in order to get its fledgling company off the ground. Unknowingly aiding a company that would become Microsoft's biggest rival in the process. Even the richest and arguably most successful person in the world has ever seen has made his fair share of mistakes. In the words of the man himself, success is a lousy teacher. It seduces smart people into thinking they cannot lose. Lessons learned. Failures and mistakes are inevitable to all. Learn and adapt from them. Thank you.